Welcome back to the deep dive. We're here again to really get into the source material you bring us, unpacking these complex topics.
Yeah, trying to find those insights that aren't always obvious, moving past the headlines.
Exactly. And today we're looking at Nagaland, a place that, well, let's be honest, often gets boiled down to just a few simple ideas for many people outside the region.
Right. You might hear remote, maybe conflict, or perhaps, the Hornbill Festival comes up. But the sources you shared, they paint a much, much richer picture.
So our goal here is to use this material, go beyond those quick labels, and sort of challenge what we think we know about Nagaland.
Because, yeah, the material really suggests there's this deep, complex story that just gets missed.
And it kind of kicks off with a really striking question the sources pose right away. Why do so many Nagas feel like strangers in their own country?
Well, what's fascinating looking at the sources is just how far back this goes. It's rooted in history that, honestly, most of us probably never learned in school.
It really is striking. The sources point out the Naga National Council declared Naga independence on August 14th, 1947. I mean, think about that date.
Yeah, the day before India's independence.
Exactly.
And the reason given, according to the sources, wasn't necessarily about, hostility. It was more this profound sense that Naga people had always been separate. Different languages, faiths, ways of governing. They didn't feel historically part of what was then considered Indian civilization.
But that declaration wasn't accepted by India. And, well, the sources trace this long, drawn-out insurgency, sometimes called a silent war, right back to that fundamental disagreement.
Yeah, decades of conflict followed. India sent in the army, Naga groups resisted, and civilians, of course, were caught in the middle of it all. It sounds incredibly difficult.
And one of the toughest things the material brings up is the Armed Forces Special Powers Act, AFSPA, passed way back in 1958.
Right. And the sources describe this law as giving soldiers really sweeping powers. The power to search, arrest, even shoot to kill.
And often with legal immunity, right? Potentially without needing warrants.
Exactly. Imagine living day to day under a law like that, where soldiers could, enter your home without a warrant or use lethal force first. That's the reality the sources describe.
So when you put that history together, declaring independence before India, and this long conflict living under AFSPA, it starts to make sense why some Nagas, as the sources suggest, might feel like they're in a place that sometimes feels, well, occupied by a foreign power. It's described as this deep feeling tied directly to that specific history. But, and this is really important, the material makes it super clear. Nagaland is not just about conflict. That's what hits the headlines, but it misses so much.
Absolutely. The sources talk about just extraordinary natural beauty that, frankly, should be famous but often isn't.
Like the Zuku Valley, described as this untouched paradise full of wildflowers. Apparently in summer, it just becomes this carpet of lilies, aconitum, euphorbia, wild herbs.
Wow.
Sounds incredible.
And places like Konoma, which the sources highlight as Asia's first green village, the whole community decided together to ban hunting and logging to protect their forests. That kind of collective action for the environment is pretty amazing.
And just as strong in the sources is the description of the people. Hospitable, proud, wise, that comes through really clearly.
And their governance structures. The material talks about how many villages are run by councils where, get this, every single adult has a voice, a vote.
Seriously, every adult.
Yeah, it's framed as this really deep-rooted grassroots democracy that existed long before, modern Indian democracy.
That just makes you think about the usual images, doesn't it? Maybe a guy with a spear at a festival or a protest sign or someone in exotic clothes.
Right. And you miss the unseen people the sources mention. The poets, the philosophers, the scientists, the fashion designers. It challenges that single story and shows this much more complex, intelligent, creative society built on these really respectful community systems.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit because the sources also bring up something really uncomfortable. Something that's described as a pervasive reality for Nagas when they leave Nagaland. Racism in mainland Indian cities.
Yeah, this theme of carrying this constant burden, this weight of suspicion and misunderstanding when they're outside the state, it comes through really strongly in the material.
The sources share this specific story about a student, Temjin, from Dimapur, who went to Delhi. Bright girl, spoke 4 languages, top of her class. But the questions she apparently faced all the time, just awful, Are you Chinese? Do you eat dogs? Do you do black magic? Just completely alienating. She wasn't seen as Indian.
And it wasn't just words. It affected practical things like finding housing. The sources mention landlords straight up refusing, saying things like, oh, Northeast people party too much. We don't rent to them. It's blatant prejudice.
And the sources are clear. This wasn't some isolated incident. It's presented as the norm, sadly. Hundreds of Naga students facing this kind of stuff, verbal abuse, sometimes even physical attacks in big cities like Bangalore, Pune, Mumbai, Delhi.
Yeah, it's systemic.
And then there's the tragic case of Nito Tanya. Remember that? A 19-year-old Naga boy beaten to death in Delhi back in 2014.
Terrible.
The sources point out the context was apparently a racist attack where he was mistaken for being Chinese.
So you have this situation highlighted in the material. An Indian citizen dying, essentially, a foreigner's death in his own nation's capital because of how he looked. It just drives home the reality of that suspicion, that misunderstanding, and how dangerous it can be. It really impacts identity and safety.
But Nagaland isn't just taking this silently. The material shows a really powerful counter-narrative, especially from the younger generation. They're fighting back not through conflict, but through culture, through creativity.
Yeah, this part is really dynamic. There's this incredible energy described.
Totally. The sources talk about rock bands in Kohima, writing songs about identity, about injustice, indigenous hip-hop artists rapping in languages like Tenedi and Ayo, as well as English, telling their own stories.
That's fantastic. And fashion designers too, right? Blending traditional Naga patterns with modern streetwear.
Yeah. And young people on Instagram, TikTok, proudly wearing their heritage, making it cool, making it visible.
You might see a curated version of this, maybe, at the Hornbill Festival each December. The world gets a taste of that pride then.
Right. But the sources argue it goes much deeper. It's not just performance. It's described as, like, cultural resistance, a refusal to be erased or stereotyped.
So wearing those traditional patterns, it's not just clothing, it's a symbol of survival almost.
Exactly. The sources connected back to that history of being told they're outsiders, that they don't belong. And this new generation is basically saying, no, we define ourselves. They're telling their story on Instagram, on stage, on the streets. It's framed as this really deliberate, creative fight for identity and visibility. Okay, there's another really critical layer the sources dig into. The whole struggle over Nagaland's resources. The land itself is apparently sitting on a lot of untapped wealth, oil, timber, minerals.
Which immediately raises that uncomfortable question the material poses. Who's actually benefiting from all this? Or who would benefit?
Yeah, and the sources give this example from Woka back in 2009, an oil discovery. The local villagers thought, okay, this could be huge, this could really change our lives for the better.
Makes sense.
But then what apparently happened, according to the sources, were these big corporate deals, government contracts, often involving the military, and crucially, done without the real consent of the local people whose land it was.
Oh, boy. So the consequences described are pretty grim.
Yeah, land leased out, forests cut down, rivers getting polluted, promises made and then broken. The communities often felt left behind, or worse off.
And this explains, the sources say, why many of the traditional tribal councils are wary or even opposed to big extraction projects run by outsiders. It's not that they're anti-development necessarily,
Right.
but they've seen this pattern before, described as, outsiders come, they take, and they leave us with the mess.
And it's tied to how they view land, isn't it? The sources really emphasize this. For Naga people, land isn't just like real estate you buy and sell.
No, it's described as sacred. It holds their history, their ancestors, their spirit. It's fundamental to their identity.
So when someone comes and takes that land, or exploits it without asking, without genuine partnership.
It's not just an economic transaction. It's seen as deeply violating, like robbing them of a part of who they are. That resource conflict is tied right into that sacred view of land and, well, that history of exploitation the sources describe.
And finally, there's one more aspect the sources highlight, maybe another hidden truth for many outside the region. Nagaland is overwhelmingly Christian.
Yeah, one of the few Christian majority regions in Asia, actually. The material notes almost 90% are Baptists, which is a legacy of American missionaries back in the 19th century.
But the role of the church, according to the sources, it goes way beyond just Sunday services, right?
Oh, absolutely. Churches are described as these vital community centers. They run schools, provide shelter, they're hubs for emergency relief, and they're places where culture is kept alive and celebrated too. Faith is really woven into the fabric of the community.
And yet, even this part of their identity, the sources mention, can sometimes lead to subtle discrimination when Naga Christians are in other parts of India. their customs, prayers, church music, sometimes mocked or misunderstood.
So what really comes through in the material is that this faith isn't just about belief systems. It's described as a core source of their community's strength, their resilience, especially when facing these kinds of external challenges.
So when we try to pull all these threads together, this complex history, the feeling of being distinct, the stunning natural beauty, those unique village democracies,
And then the harsh reality of racism faced outside, the creative cultural pushback, the fight over land and resources, and this deeply embedded Christian faith.
it really brings us back to that core question the sources seem to be asking. Why don't we know this stuff already? Why is Nagaland so often just a footnote, missing from the mainstream conversation?
And the answer suggested in the material isn't easy. Maybe it's because Nagaland's story, it just doesn't fit the simple narratives we're used to. It's portrayed as too different, maybe too proud, definitely too complicated.
But that complexity, the sources argue, is precisely why we need to pay attention. Just listening, really trying to understand a story like this, is presented as the first act of respect.
And respect, the material suggests, is the necessary first step towards any kind of understanding, maybe even healing.
The sources give us this really powerful way to think about Nagaland as we wrap up. It's described not just as a place on a map, but as a nation of poets, warriors, and dreamers.
A land of ancient wisdom that's also buzzing with modern rebellion.
It's not just on the edge of India, the sources say. It feels more like the edge of awakening.
It makes you think, doesn't it? How much of the world's richness, its complexity, stays hidden when we only stick to the easy, simplified stories we're told.
Well, we really hope this deep dive, guided by the material you brought to us, has maybe offered a glimpse into a Nagaland that's, well, a lot more profound and complex than the usual stereotypes allow.
Yeah, definitely. And if any of this resonated with you, please share it. Maybe share it with someone who could benefit from, unlearning some assumptions.
We definitely encourage you to reflect on what you've heard. Maybe dig deeper based on the fascinating material we touched on. Let's keep the conversation going.
Thanks so much for joining us for this deep dive.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep listening.